I got added to a group chat I was never supposed to see. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Just a random notification, a name I didn't recognize, and then messages started coming in.
Fast.
Like I had dropped into the middle of something already in progress. I saw my husband's name, and a few of his friends. It was supposed to be their guy's trip. That's what he told me. A weekend away, just them, nothing unusual. So when I saw the messages, I wasn't expecting anything serious. Until I read one line. And then another. And then I realized something. This wasn't a guy's trip. And I wasn't supposed to be there. Because the way they were talking wasn't the way you talk when you think someone's watching. That was the moment I stopped scrolling like it was nothing. And started reading it carefully. Because whatever was happening on that trip, it wasn't what I had been told. My name is Rachel. I'm 31 now, and at the time this happened, I had been married for a little over 5 years. We had a quiet kind of marriage. Not distant, not cold, just settled. The kind where you don't question things because nothing is actively wrong. My husband, Jason, was consistent in a way that made life feel predictable. Same routines, same habits, same general rhythm every day. He woke up at the same time, left for work at the same time, came home at the same time. Even the way he moved through the house didn't really change. And for a long time, I thought that meant everything was stable. We didn't argue much. When we did, it was small things. Schedules, plans, normal disagreements that didn't carry over into the next day. There was no tension sitting underneath anything. At least not that I could see. Our evenings were usually quiet. Dinner sometimes together, sometimes just in the same space. TV on in the background. Occasional conversation, but not constant. Comfortable silence. That's what it felt like. Comfortable. And over time, you stop analyzing comfortable things. You just live in them. Jason's friends had always been a big part of his life. Not in a way that interfered with anything. Just consistent. The same group of guys he had known for years. They had their own dynamic. Inside jokes, shared history, a kind of familiarity that doesn't need explanation. I had spent time around them enough to understand how they were. Loud sometimes. A little immature in the way long-term friendships can be. But nothing that ever felt serious. Nothing that made me uncomfortable. They were just his friends. And that's how I saw it. Something separate from our relationship, but not in conflict with it. Every once in a while, they would plan a trip. Not often. Just enough that it became something expected. A few days away. Same group. Same idea. Relax, disconnect, spend time together. I never questioned those trips. Because they had always been presented the same way. Open. Simple. Nothing hidden. Jason would tell me about them casually. Where they were going. Who was coming. How long they would be gone. There was never any hesitation in how he explained it. And that made it easy to trust. Because when someone sounds certain, you don't go looking for uncertainty. This trip was no different. At least, that's how it felt at the time. He mentioned it one evening while we were sitting together. Said they had been planning it for a while, and finally locked it in. Same tone as always. No build-up. No hesitation. Just information. I asked a few basic questions. Where they were staying. How long they would be gone. Who was going. He answered everything easily. Without thinking. Like it had already been decided. And nothing about it stood out. That's what I remember most. Nothing stood out. The days leading up to it were normal. He packed the same way he always did. Not rushed. Not overly organized. Just routine. Clothes, a small bag, nothing excessive. There was no secrecy in it. No last-minute changes. No behavior that would make me look twice. We talked about small things. What I would be doing while he was gone. What he planned to do there. Nothing detailed. Just general conversation. And I didn't push for more. Because I didn't feel like I needed to. That's what trust looks like most of the time. Not asking questions because there's no reason to. The morning he left felt exactly like every other time he had gone somewhere.
Calm.
No tension. No emotional buildup. He got ready, grabbed his bag, said goodbye. Told me he would text when he got there. And he did. A simple message. Short. Consistent with everything else. The first day went exactly how I expected. A few messages throughout the day. Not constant. Just enough to stay connected. Updates about the drive. A quick message when they arrived. Nothing detailed. But nothing missing either. It matched the version of events he had given me. And that made everything feel solid. The second day was quieter. Fewer messages. But that didn't feel unusual. Trips like that aren't about staying on your phone. People get busy. Distracted. Focused on whatever they're doing. So, I didn't question it. I didn't feel the need to check him more. Because everything still fit. Everything still made sense. Looking back, there were small things. Tiny details that didn't stand out at the time. Like how his messages became shorter. Less specific. Or how the timing of them felt slightly more spaced out than usual. But nothing strong enough to question. Nothing that broke the overall picture. And when the overall picture stays intact, you don't focus on the edges. You accept it as it is. That's what I did. I stayed in that version of things. The one where everything was still exactly what it looked like. The one where there was no reason to look deeper. Because nothing had happened yet to force me to. Nothing had interrupted the pattern. Nothing had made me stop and reconsider anything. Until that message came in. And once that happened, everything I thought was simple started to feel a little less certain. The message came in late. Not late enough to be unusual, but late enough that I noticed it immediately. I was on my phone not doing anything important, just scrolling the way you do when the day is quiet. And then a notification popped up. A group chat. At first, I didn't recognize the name. It wasn't saved in my phone. Just a random combination of numbers and a few names. But then more messages started coming in. Fast. One after another. Like I had just stepped into the middle of an ongoing conversation. That's when I saw his name. Jason. And then a few of his friends. The same ones he was supposed to be on the trip with. For a second, I just stared at the screen, trying to understand what I was looking at. Because I hadn't been added to any group. I hadn't been told about anything. And this didn't look like something meant for me. It felt like I had been added by mistake. Like someone tapped the wrong contact. I didn't say anything. I didn't react. I just watched. More messages came in. Casual at first. Jokes. Short responses. Nothing that stood out on its own. And for a moment, I thought maybe it was exactly what it looked like. Just a group chat. Just conversation. Then something shifted. One message. Short. But enough. Make sure she doesn't find out. It wasn't directed at me. It wasn't even clear who it was about. But it changed the tone immediately. The conversation didn't stop after that. If anything, it kept going. Like that line didn't need explanation. Like everyone already understood what it meant. That was the part that made me pause. Because if something doesn't need explanation, it means it's already known. I kept reading. Not scrolling fast. Not reacting. Just taking it in. And the more I read, the more I realized something. This wasn't a conversation meant to be seen. The way they were talking wasn't filtered. It wasn't careful. There was no awareness of being watched. And that only happens when people think they're alone. That's when I noticed something else. They weren't talking about the trip the way Jason had described it. There were references to places he hadn't mentioned. Plans that didn't match what he had told me. And names. Names I didn't recognize. At first, I tried to make sense of it. Tried to fit it into the version of events I already had. But it didn't fit. No matter how I looked at it. Because what I was reading didn't match what I had been told. I didn't respond. I didn't leave the chat. I didn't let them know I was there. Because the moment they realized that, everything would change. So I stayed quiet. And I kept reading. The messages kept coming. Faster now. More open. More specific. And the tone was different. Not just casual. Comfortable. Like there was nothing to hide. That's when I saw another message. Relax. She thinks it's just us. That one didn't need interpretation. It didn't need context. It was clear. And for a moment, everything felt still. Not overwhelming. Not emotional. Just clear. Because that sentence confirmed something I hadn't fully allowed myself to think yet. This wasn't a guy's trip. Not in the way it had been explained to me. And whatever it actually was, I wasn't supposed to know about it. I kept reading after that, even though I already understood what it meant. Because once you see something like that, you don't stop at the first confirmation. You follow it. And the more I followed it, the harder it became to ignore what it was showing me. This wasn't one comment. It wasn't one misunderstanding. It was a pattern, a conversation that had been happening long before I saw it. And I had just dropped into the middle of it. That was the moment everything shifted. Not outwardly. Nothing had changed around me. But internally, I stopped seeing the trip the way I had before. And I started asking a different question. If this wasn't what he said it was, then what exactly was it? And how long had it been happening like this, without me knowing? After that message, I didn't stop reading, even though I already understood what it meant. Because once something shifts like that, you need to see how far it goes. The messages kept coming. Not slower. Not more careful. Exactly the same. Which told me something important. No one knew I was there. No one had realized what happened. So whatever I was seeing was unfiltered. That's rare. And I knew I wasn't going to get that kind of access again. So I stayed quiet. Didn't type. Didn't react. Just watched. At first, I tried to understand the structure of the conversation. Who was speaking? Who was responding? What kind of dynamic they had? And the more I paid attention, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a group of friends talking. There were plans. Coordinated ones. References to places. Times. Specific arrangements. And none of it matched what I had been told. I started going back through earlier messages. Scrolling up slowly. Carefully. Because this conversation hadn't started when I joined. It had been going long before that. And what I saw there changed everything. There were messages from earlier that day. And the day before. Same tone. Same kind of conversation. And then I saw something that made me stop. Pictures. Not sent directly to the chat. But referenced. Jokes about them. Comments about where they were. And it wasn't the hotel Jason had told me about. That was the first clear break. Because up until then, I could have tried to explain things. Maybe plans changed. Maybe something was different. But this didn't fit. It wasn't a small detail. It was the entire setting. And then there were names. Not just the usual group. Different ones. Names I had never heard before. Mentioned casually. Like they were expected. Like they were part of the plan. That's when the pattern started forming more clearly. This wasn't just a guy's trip. It wasn't even close. This was something else entirely. Something planned. Something understood between all of them. And something I had been deliberately kept out of. I kept reading, even though by that point I already knew enough. Because I needed to understand the structure. Not just the fact that it was happening, but how it was happening. There were jokes about keeping things quiet. Comments about timing. Mentions of making sure certain things didn't overlap. And the more I saw, the more consistent it became. This wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't last minute. This had been planned. Carefully. And followed exactly the way they intended. I started noticing how Jason interacted in the chat. He wasn't leading it, but he was fully part of it. Comfortable. Engaged. Responding without hesitation. That was the part that stayed with me. Because there was no difference between how he was there and how he had been with me. No sign of conflict. No sign of hesitation. Just two versions of the same person. Existing at the same time. That realization didn't feel dramatic. It felt precise. Like something clicking into place. Because once you see that clearly, you stop trying to explain it. You just accept what it is. I kept scrolling. Further back. looking for where it started. And I found messages from before the trip, planning it. Not the version I had been told. The real version. Discussions about where they would go, who would be there, what they were going to do. And none of it matched what I had heard. That was the moment I understood something fully. This wasn't something that changed during the trip. This was the plan from the beginning. And I had been given a different version of it. On purpose. That's when the question shifted again. Not what is happening, but how long has this been happening? Because something like this doesn't start out of nowhere. It builds. It repeats. It becomes normal for the people involved. And the more I thought about that, the more everything else started to feel different. Every previous trip, every explanation, every time I didn't question anything, all of it started to look like part of the same pattern. Not separate events, not isolated moments, but something consistent, something I just hadn't seen clearly before. And once that realization settled in, there was no going back to the version of things I had before. Because now I wasn't looking at one situation. I was looking at a pattern, one that had been there long before I was added to that chat. The only difference was, this time, I had seen it from the inside. Once I saw the pattern, I stopped reacting to the messages themselves, because I already knew what they meant. What I needed now was to understand how much of it was real, and how much of it had been hidden from me before. So I stayed in the chat, quietly, didn't leave, didn't mute it, didn't let anything change, because as long as they didn't know I was there, they would keep talking the same way, and that mattered. The messages kept coming, not constantly, but enough to keep the picture clear. I started paying attention to details I would have ignored before. Locations, timing, who was where, what they were doing. And slowly, things started to line up, not with what Jason had told me, but with each other. That's when I started checking something else. His messages to me, side by side with what I was seeing in the chat. Not emotionally, just logically. He would text me saying they were at dinner. At the same time, the chat would mention something completely different. A different place, a different plan, and the timing would match exactly. That was the first clear confirmation. Not just that something was different, but that I was being told one version, while something else was happening in real time. I didn't react. I didn't question him. I answered his messages the same way I always did, because I needed him to stay exactly where he was. Comfortable, unaware. The more I compared things, the clearer it became. This wasn't just one lie. It was structured, consistent, maintained across multiple conversations. And that kind of consistency takes effort. It takes planning, which meant this wasn't new. It had been happening long enough to become normal for him. I scrolled further back in the chat again, looking for more than just what was happening now, looking for anything that connected to before. And I found it. References to previous trips. Inside jokes about things that had happened. Comments that only made sense if this wasn't the first time. That was the moment it shifted from a situation to a pattern. Because once something repeats, it stops being an exception and starts being behavior. I didn't feel the need to confirm anything else after that. But I kept watching anyway. Not because I needed more proof, but because I wanted to see how it ended. Because the way something ends tells you just as much as how it starts. Over the next day, the messages slowed down. Not completely, but less frequent. Like the main part of the trip was already over. And the tone changed slightly. Still relaxed, still open, but less active. Like everything had already happened, and they were just winding down. That's when I realized something else. None of this felt hidden to them. It didn't feel secret. It felt normal, like something they had done before, and expected to do again. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the details, not the specific messages, just the ease of it, the lack of hesitation, the complete absence of concern. because that only happens when something has never been questioned. I didn't take screenshots right away. I didn't rush to save anything, because I understood something clearly. I didn't need proof for him. I already had clarity for myself. But I still noted what mattered. Specific messages. Specific lines. Things that couldn't be explained differently. Because when I said something, I didn't want it to turn into interpretation. I wanted it to stay exactly as it was. Clear. Undeniable. By the time the trip was ending, I wasn't trying to figure anything out anymore. I already knew. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. It wasn't about one situation. It was about a version of reality I had been given, and a completely different one that had been happening alongside it. And I had finally seen both. At the same time, that was enough. Because once you see something that clearly, you don't need to question it anymore. You just decide what to do with it. And by that point, I already knew the only thing left was when to say something, and how to say it in a way that didn't give him space to change it. Because now, it wasn't about finding the truth. It was about letting it stay exactly where it was. By the time he came back, I wasn't waiting for answers anymore. I already had them. What I needed now was to see how he would respond when he realized I knew. That was the only part that wasn't clear yet. He came home in the evening. Same time he said he would. Same routine. He walked in, set his bag down, stretched slightly like he always did after a trip. Nothing about him felt different. That was the first thing I noticed. No hesitation. No awareness. Just normal. He started talking almost immediately about the drive back, about how tired he was, about small things that didn't matter. And I let him. I didn't interrupt. I didn't guide the conversation, because I wanted to see how much of the version he would maintain on his own. And he stayed consistent. Same locations he had mentioned before. Same timeline. Same general tone. Like everything had gone exactly the way he described it before he left. That part was precise. Controlled. Rehearsed in a way that didn't feel obvious, but felt practiced. I sat there and listened, not reacting, not questioning, just observing. Because once you stop reacting, you start seeing more clearly. He kept talking for a while. Not too long. Just enough to fill the space. Then eventually he stopped, and there was a pause. The kind that usually leads into something normal. A question. A shift in conversation. But this time, it stayed there. And that's when I spoke. Did you enjoy it? Simple. Neutral. Nothing in my tone that suggested anything else. He nodded. Yeah, it was good. Quick. Easy. Automatic. That answer didn't require thought, which meant he wasn't expecting anything different. That gave me control of what came next. I waited a second, just long enough for the moment to settle. Then I said, "Do you want to tell me what actually happened?" That was the shift. And I saw it immediately. Not in his words. In his pause. It wasn't long. Just a second. But it was enough. Because it didn't belong in the version of the conversation he thought we were having. What do you mean? Still calm. Still controlled. But now there was awareness. Not of what I knew, but that something had changed. I didn't explain. I didn't clarify. I just reached for my phone, opened the chat, and placed it on the table between us. Slowly. No sudden movement. No emotion attached to it. Just placing it there. He looked at it briefly at first, like he expected it to be something small. Then he looked again, longer this time. And that was the moment everything shifted. Because recognition doesn't need time. It's immediate. You either understand what you're looking at, or you don't. And he did. I didn't say anything. I didn't point at specific messages. I didn't guide him through it, because I didn't need to. Everything was already there. Clear. Unfiltered. Undeniable. He kept looking for a few seconds, then leaned back slightly, like he needed space from it. And that silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't uncertainty. This was exposure. He said something about it not being what it looked like. About jokes. About things being taken the wrong way. And I listened, because I wanted to see how far he would go. Not to convince me, but to maintain control of the situation. He tried to simplify it, reduce it, turn it into something smaller than it was. But the problem with that was the consistency. It wasn't one message. It wasn't one moment. It was a full conversation. Over time, with details that couldn't be adjusted. And he knew that. That's why his explanations didn't stay steady. They shifted slightly each time. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to try to find something that would fit. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him. I didn't challenge anything he said, because I wasn't there to argue. I was there to observe. And eventually, he stopped. Not because he had nothing left to say, but because nothing he said was working. And that's when the room went quiet again. But this time, it felt final. I picked up my phone, not to hide it, just to remove it from between us. Because I didn't need it anymore. The point had already been made. I looked at him, not waiting, not expecting anything, just seeing him clearly. And that clarity was enough. Because once you see someone without the version you believed in, there's nothing left to question. I didn't ask for details. Didn't ask who was there. Didn't ask how long it had been happening. Because I already understood the structure of it. And the structure tells you everything you need to know. I stood up. Not abruptly. Just calmly. And he watched me. Like he expected something else. A reaction. A question. An argument. But there wasn't one. Because I wasn't in that position anymore. I walked away from the conversation. Not to avoid it, but because it was already complete. Nothing else needed to be said. Nothing else would change what was already clear. And that was the moment everything shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just completely. Because from that point on, there was no version of things where I didn't know. And once that happens, there's only one thing left to decide. What you're going to do with it. After that night, nothing needed to be said again. Not because everything was resolved, but because everything was already clear. We stayed in the same space, but it didn't feel shared anymore. It felt divided. Like there were two separate versions of reality sitting in the same room, and only one of them still made sense. The next morning was quiet, not tense, not uncomfortable, just distant. He moved through his routine the same way he always had. Coffee, phone, getting ready, small movements that hadn't changed, but the meaning behind them had. Because now I wasn't seeing the routine. I was seeing the person inside it. And that made everything feel different. He tried to speak a few times. Not directly about what happened. Just normal conversation. Questions about the day. Small comments. Like things could return to what they were. And that told me something important. He wasn't trying to fix what happened. He was trying to continue around it. Like if enough normal moments happened, it would settle on its own. I answered him, but not the way I used to. There was no effort in it. No extension. Just simple responses that ended where they needed to. Because I wasn't trying to rebuild anything. That part was already over. Over the next few days, he tried again. More directly this time. Bringing it up in pieces. Different explanations. Different angles. Trying to find one that would hold. But the structure didn't change. And that's the thing about something like that. Once you've seen the full pattern, the explanation doesn't matter anymore. Because the pattern is the explanation. I didn't argue. I didn't point anything out. I didn't correct him. Because I wasn't trying to convince him of anything. I was just done trying to understand. And that was the shift. Not anger. Not confrontation. Just clarity. The house started to feel quieter. Not physically. Just emotionally. Less interaction. Less shared space. Less reason to be in the same room at the same time. And none of it felt forced. It felt natural, like things were adjusting to what had already changed. I started spending more time outside, not to avoid him, just because being there didn't feel necessary anymore. I focused on things I had been putting aside. Work, friends, my own routine, things that didn't require me to question anything, because that's what I needed. Something that made sense without effort. At night, I would come back, and the house would feel the same. Quiet, separate, unshared. He would still be there, still moving through his routine, still trying occasionally to start conversations, but less each time, because he could see the distance, even if he didn't fully understand it. A week passed like that, then another, and at some point, it stopped feeling temporary. It stopped feeling like something that needed to be addressed, and started feeling like something that had already ended. That's when I made the decision. Not in a single moment, not suddenly, just gradually, like something that had already been forming. I didn't announce it. I didn't sit him down for a conversation, because there was nothing left to explain. I started packing small things. Not everything at once, just enough to shift my space. Important things, personal things, the things that felt like mine. And over time, it became clear, not through words, but through action. I was leaving. He noticed. Of course he did. But he didn't stop me. Not directly. He asked a few questions, tried once or twice to bring things back into conversation. But there was no direction in it. No real attempt to change anything. Because deep down, he already knew. That part had already been decided. The day I left wasn't dramatic. No argument. No final conversation. No moment where everything came out at once. Just a quiet transition. I packed what was left, closed the door, and stepped out. And that was it. No build-up. No aftermath in that moment. Just done. The first few days after felt different. Not emotional. Not overwhelming. Just still. Like everything had stopped moving. And for the first time in a long time, there was nothing to question. Nothing to compare. Nothing to analyze. Because everything matched again. What I saw. What I understood. What I accepted. It was all the same. And that kind of clarity changes how things feel. I didn't go back to the chat. I didn't reread anything. I didn't try to understand more than I already did. Because I didn't need to. I had seen enough. The pattern. The behavior. The consistency. That was all that mattered. Anything beyond that would just be detail. And detail doesn't change the meaning. He reached out a few times after I left. Messages. Calls. Explanations. But they followed the same structure. Trying to reshape something that was already clear. And I didn't respond. Not because I was avoiding it, but because there was nothing left to say. The situation had already answered itself. And I accepted that. I also thought about his friends. The ones in that chat. The way they spoke. The way they treated it like something normal. And I realized something about that too. People don't act like that unless it's been allowed for a long time. Unless it's been repeated enough to feel familiar. And that told me this wasn't just one trip. It was a pattern. One I had just seen clearly for the first time. And once I understood that, I stopped looking at it as something I had lost. And started seeing it as something I had stepped out of. That made a difference. Because loss feels heavy. But clarity doesn't. Clarity feels settled. I still think about it sometimes. Not with anger. Not with regret. Just with understanding. Because that situation showed me something I wouldn't have seen otherwise. That people don't reveal the truth in what they say. They reveal it in what they do when they think no one is watching. And once you see that, you don't need anything else. For me, that was enough. I didn't need closure from him. I didn't need a full explanation. I didn't need to understand every detail. I just needed to trust what I had already seen. and choose not to stay in something that required me to ignore it. That was the decision. And once I made it, everything else followed naturally. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to make something work. I was choosing something that already did. Peace. If you've ever had a moment where something didn't match what you were being told, but you couldn't explain it at first, you're not alone. Sometimes the truth isn't hidden. It's just not obvious until you see the pattern. And once you see it, you don't need anything else to confirm it. If this story made you think about something in your own life, let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, there are more waiting for you right here.